Hunter, I'm looking to expand my research into other statuses.
Oh yeah, no problem. Do you want to sleep with me?
I
mean, sleep monsters with me.
I think that you should do that alone.
That's what they all say.
Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages,
Today it's time to talk all about the 4 main statuses that players can apply in Monster Hunter Wilds, how they work in general, the specific numbers behind each one, and which of them are actually worth properly using in different scenarios as well. Skills related to statuses, at least in the less obvious ways. I don't want to talk about the ones that just increase your buildup amount, but there are other ones that are worth mentioning. All of this is especially relevant due to Artian weapons being all over the high-end build meta, because Artian weapons with statuses have the same amount of raw attack and affinity potential as Artian weapons without them, which has drawn a lot of people towards trying out statuses who normally wouldn't. First things first then, let's talk about the general mechanics of statuses in Wilds. Like element numbers on your weapons on your status screen, these show an inflated value relative to what they actually act like in-game. To know your true status values, divide the shown number by 10. This divided value is the amount of status applied to the monster when triggered. Status has a 1 in 3 chance of applying when you hit the monster, so on average you will do 1/3 of your divided status value per hit. So with 180 poison on my weapon, I deal 18 poison buildup per proc, which means I get 6 poison buildup per hit on average. This then builds up against a monster's status thresholds. You get basic versions of these in-game through star ratings in the monster field guide, with more stars meaning more weakness. But you can also use online resources like the Kiranico database to see extremely specific numbers for something like status buildups. A great example that I'm going to be using a lot for poison tests later on is Shiwu. After you trigger a status proc against a monster, they will then be slightly more resistant to that same status, making it take more hits to proc that a second time, then even more hits to proc it a third time, so on and so forth, until it reaches an upper limit eventually of a cap. But you are unlikely to actually breach that cap while hunting unless you put every ounce of your build into status procs. That said, the amount of status resistance that a monster has will stay the same over time, so if you poison Shiwu multiple times in a row, and then even if you wait like 10 minutes before reapplying another poison to the monster, if it was going to need 370 buildup requirement, it would stay 370 buildup requirement. It does not go back down. As well, the status buildup that you get on a monster by hitting them will decay, meaning if you build up even to 365 out of that 370 poison requirement, if you then stop hitting the monster, that will then decay at a rate of 5 buildup lost every 10 seconds, according to Kiranico's data mines. And it's the same for all statuses and all monsters, so if you stop attacking the monster at any point, it will just take longer to apply a status than if you were hitting it consistently. The amount lost isn't overly terrible, but it's just enough to incentivize being aggressive with status builds. That pretty much covers the basics of status then, so now let's dive into each one in particular, starting with poison as the most generally complex of the ones we can use. Once you have reached the poison buildup threshold on a monster, they will start to tick for gray numbers of damage. In high rank, this is 15 damage done to the monster for each tick, the duration that poison lasts for, the rate of these damage ticks, and thus the overall damage of a poison proc is dependent on how poison weak a monster is. So the star ratings in the field guide, for poison at least, not only apply to how much buildup is required to apply the status and how much extra resistance is gained when it's triggered, but also to the actual effectiveness of the status itself. Monsters with 1 star poison weakness become poisoned for 15 seconds, taking 1 tick of damage per second, so 15 ticks of 15 damage for a total of 225 damage every time that you manage to poison them. Monsters with 2 star poison weakness become poisoned for 20 seconds, taking 1 tick of damage per second, so 20 ticks of 15 damage for 300 total damage each time that poison triggers on those monsters. Monsters with 3-star poison weakness become poisoned for 25 seconds, but take 31 ticks of damage over that time, not 30, specifically 31 exactly. This means it ticks faster, and 31 ticks of 15 damage is a total of 465 damage for a poison proc on a 3-star weak monster. Poison duration up is a skill that exists and is worth talking about here. It increases the duration of poisons by approximately 20%. This means on a 1-star poison weak monster it adds 45 damage overall, On a 2-star weak monster, it adds 60 damage per proc, and on 3-star weakness, it adds 105 damage to a poison proc, which isn't terrible, but overall it's not much value added for monsters that are 1 or 2-star weakness, but it does bump up again a fair bit against the monsters that are 3-star weak. I wouldn't recommend going for poison duration up as a skill unless you are really going full in on having poison active, however. It's just not that valuable overall, at least not in its current state, compared to what you actually have to invest in to get it on a weapon, unless you're specifically using a Rathian weapon, in which case it's just a nice bonus. In Monster Hunter Rise, they also changed how poison worked specifically as a status. Before this, when a monster was poisoned, you could not apply more poison buildup to the monster, which meant that you had to wait for the poison to end before you could start the fresh buildup. In Rise, and however, and now in Monster Hunter Wilds as well, you can build up poison while a monster is already suffering from poison. You can see this yourself on the training dummy, just beating the thing up in a poison status setup until it is poisoned, then continuing to beat on it for another 19 seconds. The poison will end at 20 seconds because the cart counts as 2-star weakness, and then if you hit a couple of times, poison will then reactivate instantly because you can apply buildup to a monster that is already poisoned. You just need to then push it over the edge to properly proc it again after the poison ends, because you can't restart it while it's already going. You have to hit the monster again at the end. Overall, poison is not a bad status in Wilds. As we go through this though, I will explain why others are generally better. Poison is actually a solid choice, however, against monsters that are properly 3-star weak to it. However, there are only 4 monsters that applies to in the game right now: Chadacabra, Quematrice, Hirabami, and Shiwu. So not even any of the apexes are proper heavily farmed monsters in the endgame really, and that is the main reason that poison is considered relatively weak at the moment in Wilds compared to some other statuses. It is genuinely good against monsters that are weak to it, but right now nothing actually threatening is properly weak to poison. It's also worth mentioning, in a world where future title updates introduce highly farmable monsters that are weak to poison, there is also the foray skill. This gives you attack and affinity against poisoned or paralyzed monsters. Generally you're better off using this with poison, as poison is a longer duration, so higher uptime, and the short windows of paralysis. And while statistically this is best compared to being like agitator, except triggering on statuses instead of enrage, and so the general rule of thumb is it is only good if you can keep it active more often than you would keep agitator active. You can do that against the 3-star weak poison monsters. I killed this entire Shiwu with him being poisoned from the first tick until he died, not using foray, however, as a skill, mind you, but it was to prove a point that poison weak monsters really do get messed up by poison, and you can keep it on them for their whole health bar. That said, right now, with nothing threatening being weak to poison, foray gets shafted a bit, and even more so by just not having decent ranks of foray as a skill on otherwise good armor like we do with agitator and such. Moving on then, next I want to talk about blast, the other main damaging status. Poison deals damage over time after being triggered, whereas blast just builds up until you trigger it, and then when it happens you get a pop of damage immediately. You then start working towards the next pop of damage again. This damage, like poison, ignores hit zones, which makes it uniquely good against monsters that have bad hit zones for your weapon. Unlike poison, blast is much simpler to explain, however. Again, there is a build-up threshold per monster, but every monster except for one in Wilds has matching thresholds for blast, which is 70 build-up for the first proc, increased by 30 for each subsequent proc 2, up to a maximum cap of 670 blast build-up per proc. You will never reach that point really, but an average player in a build that has a blast weapon, without being fully blast focused, will get 7, maybe 8 blast procs in a hunt on average. Blast deals a flat 150 damage each time that it triggers, so that puts our estimate at around 1050 to 1200 damage per hunt with just a general blast weapon. For reference, this is the equivalent of 4 poisons worth of damage against a 2-star weak monster. The main difference is you can apply those 7 blasts way faster than you can 4 poisons, and more consistently in general too, so it front loads your damage, which is generally better than having it take over time, and blast explosions build up to things like part breaks and flinches too. That said, my general stance as of this point in base Wilds is that blast is pretty much just better than poison outside of those specific 4 monsters that are particularly weak to poison, and even then there's the exception that 3 of those 4 likely won't live long enough for you to get them as a result. So right now, the only monster that I really recommend going for poison over blast on for pure damage is Shiwu, especially as blast is genuinely equally effective against almost every single monster in the game, except for new Udra, who is slightly blast resistant, and so I don't really recommend blast against that singular monster either as a result. Next up then, let's talk about Paralysis, as that has been in a bit of a spotlight recently in base Monster Hunter Wilds, and this is one of the two lockdown statuses. I like to split them into Poison and Blast as damage statuses, and then Paralysis and Sleep as the lockdown statuses. Paralysis, once you reach its build-up threshold on a monster, will freeze the monster in place with electricity coursing through them for a relatively long duration, during which you can beat on it freely with your weapon. You can stop to heal or sharpen, whatever you want really. You can do what you want because the monster can't hurt you. While this isn't a direct damage dealing status in itself, the downtime that it creates on the monster results in letting you do your biggest, nastiest, longest, highest damage combos absolutely free with no danger at all. And that makes Paralysis incredibly effective for damage dealing builds as a result, because if you have high damage within your setup, you can get a lot more out of a Paralysis window than you can from a blast proc or a poison proc, especially for the slower, more combo heavy weapon types. That said, like the other statuses, monsters have 1-star, 2-star, or 3-star weakness to Paralysis. Most monsters are 2-star weakness, and nothing genuinely threatening is full 3-star weakness. This affects the status build-up requirements and the resistances the monster gains after each proc, meaning that more weakness allows easier repeat procs of the status. But for Paralysis, it also specifically decides the duration of the effect, which many players don't realize. A 1-star Paralysis weak monster will be paralyzed for 8 seconds on the first proc. A 2-star Paralysis weak monster will be paralyzed for 10 seconds on its first proc of the status, and then a 3-star weak monster to Paralysis will be paralyzed for 12 seconds after its first proc of Paralysis. So a pretty major difference between 1-star weakness and 3-star weakness there. That said, in a heavy Paralysis build, you can still get 6 Paralysis procs on like a 1-star weak monster over the course of a fight, so Paralysis is extremely strong in Wilds. With minimal Paralysis investment, which would be using like an Artian weapon that has Paralysis on it, and otherwise just going full raw attack and affinity and damage increases, you're likely to get around 2, maybe 3 Paralysis per hunt on average, depending on the monster. Crafted weapons tend to have a good chunk more Paralysis on them specifically, and a crafted monster para weapon can hit 4 Paralysis procs per hunt pretty consistently, even without any investment from skills and such. And then if you go full in on Paralysis, you can get some crazy amounts of lockdown as a result. That said, an extra note here is that monsters will be paralyzed for less duration the more that it happens to them. The second Paralysis will last less time than the first Paralysis, and this continues onwards for further procs too. An example to show this is that the first Paralysis against Nerscylla is 12 seconds long, but the fourth Paralysis in a single hunt against that same Nerscylla only lasts for 10 seconds, so you lose 2 seconds of duration by proccing it repeatedly. Of course, this isn't a major difference, you still would love to have that 10 seconds of downtime, and this is the fourth Paralysis of the same hunt, but it's worth knowing that going full in on Paralysis does give you some diminishing returns eventually in a couple of different ways because of the build-up resistance too. That said, the duration doesn't go down enough to make Paralysis bad, so I still heavily recommend it as a status. And for most weapon types, if you are looking to use a status, I consider Paralysis to be the best one currently in Wilds, but that depends on a number of factors as well. Blast is the simpler one, just free damage as you attack. Paralysis takes a bit more planning to avoid overlapping with stuff like mounts or stuns or stuff like that, and to make sure that you can actually take advantage of the monster getting locked up, whereas Blast is just simple bonus damage as you hit them. Then the last status that we'll be talking about today is Sleep. Sleep is arguably the simplest of these statuses, but only if you have the prior knowledge of how sleep works with monsters in general. A sleeping monster will be woken up by the first hit that connects with it once it is properly sleeping, which we call a wake-up hit. This wake-up hit deals exactly double the damage that it would otherwise do, and this makes it ideal to wake up monsters with the biggest singular damage number hits possible. True Charge Slash for Greatsword, Mighty Charge Slam for Hammer, those types of attacks, as they gain the most value. The other trick is stuff like barrel bomb shenanigans, but generally speaking, the value of sleep is dependent on how strong a wake-up hit that you have. Like the other statuses, monsters have 3 different star ratings of sleep weakness, and for sleep, these entirely just affect the actual build-up and resistance gains, nothing else really complicated about it. The only monster that is 3-star sleep weak is Hirabami, most everything else is 2-star, with the exception of Nerscylla, Jin Dahaad, Shiwu, and Gore Magala, who are all only 1-star sleep weakness, so I really don't recommend it to go against those ones specifically. That said, once you proc sleep on a monster, it will fall over and then go to sleep for exactly 40 seconds. Every time that you proc sleep on the same monster in the same hunt, this duration will go down, so they will sleep for less time. You can't just put a monster to sleep for the full quest timer, really. The main advantages of sleep as a status are the wake-up hit for those larger, more beefy weapons and large singular number attacks, that period of downtime downtime when the monster is falling asleep to begin with, which will then allow you to heal or sharpen or whatever you need before starting combat again with the wake up hit, and then you have the control of the pace as well because you choose when to start it then. And then a lot of people are scared to use this, but after you initially proc sleep, there is an animation that every monster will do that takes right around 5 seconds for the monster to actually fall asleep. During this time, you can hit the monster as much as you want and it won't count as a wake up hit. However, if you proc a stun by hitting the head with blunt damage, paralysis, or even cause a flinch during this animation, you will cancel the sleep. That means that in more hectic moments, you can still just treat sleep like a mini paralysis rather than going all out on the wake up hit and just have it as a 5-second period of downtime from the monster where you can freely beat on it before it starts moving again. That said, I would argue that sleep is a great tool for the less confident hunters. It gives you nice long breaks so you can take the hunt at your own pace. It lets you get some chunky damage moments in on command, and it does all of this with very little pressure because the monster won't be moving once you proc the status. That said, the more comfortable you get and the better you are. The only weapon I would really recommend using sleep for properly is maybe greatsword, because while sleep makes hunts more comfortable, it makes them longer just by how it works. So if your goal is to have quick, efficient monster kills in the endgame, I would instead point you towards blast or paralysis. Generally speaking, if you have a sleep weapon without a full sleep build, you'll hit 2, maybe 3 sleeps per hunt depending on the monster and which weapon you're using, for an idea of just how frequently it will happen as well. Finally today, just one sort of major thing to point out on the topic of statuses too, is that all of these statuses count up their buildup and resistances separately. If you have one player in a hunt with a paralysis weapon and another player with a poison weapon, they don't negatively impact each other at all. However, it's worth noting that in multiplayer hunts, these status buildup requirements for monsters do actually go up. Likewise, in Wilds, we have a new system letting us switch between 2 weapons while you're on a hunt, and so you can also do things like bring a paralysis weapon until you get 2 paralysis procs, then swap off to a blast weapon for the rest of the hunt, and by doing so, you're likely to get more overall value than just using the pure para or blast weapon by themselves, because instead of raising a single resistance more and more each time you get a proc, you are spreading it between 2. Unlike older Monster Hunter games, status buildup resistance does not decay over time, and the actual buildup that you do with your weapon does still decay over time, so it's not helpful to swap weapons after applying buildup. But if you swap right after a proc, you are basically splitting up your resources to make the most of both blast and paralysis, rather than throwing all of your eggs in one basket. That said, you can do this with any combination of the 4 statuses, and how effective it is will depend on the monster that you're fighting, really, but it's something worth talking about and considering for sure, and makes double status build something that you can actually effectively do in Wilds if you want to. That just about does it for today then, everyone. A full guide to the 4 main weapon statuses in Wilds: poison, blast, paralysis, and sleep. How they function, how strong they are, any interesting notes about them, and how often you can expect to see them proc depending on the monster that you are fighting. Generally speaking, statuses are quite strong right now in base Monster Hunter Wilds, and we'll have to see how new equipment and such from title updates will continue to develop the meta as we go. I hope you've all enjoyed this then, and let me know any of your own thoughts on any of this down in the comments below. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.